Well, welcome. I can't say how pleased I am to be invited to chair today's session. This is the 22nd Mellon Colloquium that we're hosting here at the Medieval Institute in Notre Dame. It's an event that we organize every year that we're very proud of, and we'd like to thank the Mellon Foundation for endowing this series. Those of you who don't know, the Mellon Colloquium that we organize every year is tied to, of course, our Mellon Fellowship, where we invite a junior faculty to come and stay with us and research and write a book, giving them the coveted time of course release that we all seek. And this year's fellow, of course, is John Mulhall, and we're very happy to have him here. So I'll just remind everybody about the program for today, and then we'll get things started. So we will have two speakers at the beginning, John Mulhall and Tom Burman, followed by a brief coffee break, and I say brief coffee break. I think we've got 15 minutes programmed at 10:45. Then we continue with our two final speakers, Charles Burnett and Peter Adamson, closing at our fourth speaker at 11:45, where we will have the opportunity to grab a bite to eat lunch together, at which point we will convene again for Q&A and discussion. So we'll hold off on all of the questions until the end after we've heard our four speakers present. So before I introduce the first speaker, I also want to welcome those of us who are tuning in online. So our first speaker, John Mulhall, completed his PhD in Byzantine history from Harvard, and he's currently an assistant professor at Purdue University. And he's been here working on his first book project, The Republic of Translators, Islam, Byzantium, Latin Europe, and a New Age of Science and Philosophy in the 12th century. And I will let him introduce his research in further detail.
Thank you so much, Denis, and thanks to all of you for coming out here today. First of all, I wanted to say thank you to the Medieval Institute for giving me the opportunity to spend the year here. It truly has been a transformative experience, and I'm just so grateful to have been able to learn from all of you this year. I also wanted to say thank you to my fellow participants in this colloquium. It's just a tremendous honor to be able to share the stage and discuss my work with leading experts in the field. So thank you so much for being here today. And finally, I wanted to say thank you to Megan and Thompson and Tom Burman for organizing this conference and for making all this possible. So then, to turn to the talk. I'm really looking forward to talking to you all today about my book project, The Republic of Translators. And what I hope to do today really is just preview some of the major arguments of the book with a few brief illustrations of the sort of questions I ask and methodologies that I use to go about making my arguments. So I thought I'd first start by just setting the scene a little bit. So the 12th century is a moment where several dozen scholars working around the Mediterranean translated more than 200 texts of science, philosophy, and theology from Greek and Arabic into Latin. These were works such as Aristotle's Natural Philosophy, Ptolemy's Astronomy, Al-Khwarizmi's Algebra, and even the Quran itself. The translators who carried out these translations were scholars such as Gerard of Cremona, a scholar and cleric from Italy. Although educated in the Latin world, Gerard knew that the best astronomical texts were not available in Latin, and he left Italy to travel to Toledo in the hope of finding work by the ancient astronomer Ptolemy in Arabic libraries. In Toledo, Gerard found everything he was hoping for and much more. Not only did Gerard find Ptolemy's works, but he found centuries of research on Ptolemy's astronomy. Arabic authors such as al-Battani, who developed and critiqued Ptolemy's science. And the translators were also scholars such as the monk William Medicus, who traveled to Constantinople and brought back Greek books to the monastery of Saint-Denis in Paris. Now, Saint-Denis was a monastery used to the excitement of French high politics, but the advent of new, rare Greek books was every bit as exciting as the politics of the court. In the abbey's chronicle, the monks recorded the arrival of Greek books from Constantinople as the only event for the year 1167, sandwiched between entries on the birth of the king's son and the outbreak of war between the French and the English. The result of the efforts by translators such as William and Gerard was nothing short of one of the most pervasive knowledge revolutions in the history of Europe. The new texts would transform scholarship in the Latin world and serve as the backbone of European education for centuries, into the early modern period and beyond. So while the impact of the translations on the intellectual history of Europe is well known, the processes by which these translations were produced have remained largely unexplored. Questions such as what institutions and individuals were responsible for promoting the translations, how the translators accessed texts and knowledge unavailable in Latin, and to what extent the translation activity was integrated into the broader intellectual culture of the Latin world, all have yet to be answered. And what I propose in the book is that we can answer these and other questions if we contextualize this translation activity in the context of the medieval Mediterranean. By approaching the translation activity of the 12th century as a moment in the history of Mediterranean knowledge exchange, I think we can not only better understand this pivotal moment in world intellectual history, but also better understand the interconnected world of the medieval Mediterranean. So from the earliest days of the Annales School, scholars of the Mediterranean have insisted on the importance of looking beyond regional and political boundaries to understand the Mediterranean. Fernand Braudel famously stressed the timeless unity of the Mediterranean as a shared culture. More recently, scholars have emphasized the timeless interconnectivity of the Mediterranean. So for scholars such as Horden and Purcell, the Mediterranean is defined by the connectivity of diverse microregions. And historians of the Mediterranean economy have demonstrated particularly fruitful ways of peeling back the layers of Mediterranean interconnectivity to reveal the dynamics of the exchange of goods. Economic historians not only acknowledge the persistence of economic connections in the Mediterranean, but they're also eager to discover the many ways that goods moved, the diversity of individuals who moved them, and how these movements change over time. And so just as we ask such questions for the exchange of goods, I think we can equally ask these questions about the exchange of ideas. And this is the approach I follow in the book. What I want to ask is, what are the vectors, agents, and content of this translation activity? So answering these questions is now possible, thanks to the incredible work done on individual texts and translators, done by some of the people in this very room. And relying on this excellent work, it's now possible, like never before, to approach the translators on this Mediterranean-wide scale. What I aim to argue in the book is, first, that the translators actively integrated their new Greek and Arabic knowledge within Latin scholarly culture. And second, that by doing so, the translators linked scholarly communities of linguistically diverse contact zones in the Mediterranean with the wider Latin world beyond the Mediterranean. That is, that the translators themselves served as conduits for the diffusion of knowledge from the Mediterranean to Northern Europe and beyond. And as we look more deeply at the activity of the translators, we'll see that throughout the 12th century and around the Mediterranean, translators actively oriented their Greek and Arabic knowledge to communities of Latin scholars beyond the Mediterranean. So translators served the interests of Latin scholars by answering petitions to produce translations and new texts. They used paratextual elements, such as prefaces or glosses, to frame their translations as contributions to scholarly questions or concerns. And in one case, a translator even founded a new school to teach Latin students the new knowledge he had acquired through his translation activity. Even more remarkably, the translators did this while often operating in the Mediterranean, far removed from places generally considered to be the epicenters of Latin scholarship. By studying the translators, therefore, we can gain a rare insight into the vectors of cultural diffusion from the Mediterranean world to the world beyond the Mediterranean. This, then, is the argument of the book. And it takes the form of 6 chapters. The first chapter takes a macroscopic approach and aims to present a comprehensive overview of the movements and correspondence of the translators. The remaining 5 chapters then zoom in to focus in greater detail on particular networks of translators. And throughout these chapters, I try to reconstruct 3 aspects of the translator's activity: the translator's geography, their social bonds, and their intellectual projects. So what I thought I would do for the rest of my talk is just preview some highlights in these 3 aspects of the translator's activity to illustrate how I go about making my argument about the translators as links connecting intellectual communities across the Mediterranean. So first, we can reconstruct the geography of the translation activity. And in order to do this, I compiled a database of all the identifiable movements and the identifiable correspondence of identifiable 12th century translators. And the result is that for the first time, we can visualize the 12th century translation activity. So here you can see the map of the translators' movements. But these lines represent, I think, not only movements, but also stories of translators. So we can find on this map Gerard of Cremona's journey to Toledo. And we can find William Medicus's journey to Constantinople and his return to Saint Denis. And when we look at the map as a whole, it tells another story. We can detect some clear patterns in the movements of the translators that are difficult to spot when just looking at individuals. Specifically, we can see a major trend of the translators moving from places in the Latin world, such as northern Italy and northern Europe, including England, to the Mediterranean. But not just anywhere in the Mediterranean, but to places that we can call contact zones. That is, places with diverse populations of Latin speakers, as well as Greek or Arabic speakers, where the translators could acquire Greek or Arabic knowledge and Greek or Arabic books necessary for translation. So these are places such as Constantinople and Toledo, for example. And it's worth emphasizing that by traveling to these contact zones, the translators were traveling far away from locations typically considered to be the epicenters of Latin scholarship. These Mediterranean contact zones were not the places that most Latin scholars traveled to. Most Latin scholars in the 12th century who wanted the standard best education would be traveling to places such as Paris or Chartres and the cities of northern Italy. The translators wanted something more. But what's fascinating is that even though the translators traveled far away from these major centers of Latin scholarship, again and again, we find the translators remaining connected to them. We can start to get a sense of this by turning to the translators' correspondence. You can see here that by and large, the directionality of the previous map is reversed. Rather than going from northern Europe into the Mediterranean, as we saw on the map of the translators' movements, the vectors of the translators' correspondence seem to be going from the Mediterranean out. And so when we consider these 2 maps together, they tell a clear story. The translators were traveling to Mediterranean contact zones where they could access Greek and Arabic knowledge, and then directing this knowledge back out to communities of Latin scholars around the Mediterranean and in northern Europe. What we're seeing here, I think, are the gears of Mediterranean interconnectivity in action. The translators as agents of cultural diffusion from the Mediterranean to northern Europe. So now that we have just a little sense of the geography of the translation activity, we can try to dig deeper into these connections. For the map of the translator's correspondence here also tells a story about scholarly relationships, about scholars communicating with other individuals. Who were these individuals that the translators were corresponding with? And what are the relationships behind these lines of correspondence that we can trace on this map? This brings us to part 2, social bonds and institutions. So one of the surprising discoveries that emerges when we approach the translators together is that their activity was remarkably decentralized. There was no one single patron or group of patrons at the top directing this translation activity. No king or pope or emperor who orchestrated the translators. And just as the translators were spread out geographically across the Mediterranean, they were also spread out across a variety of institutions. We find translators who were connected to royal or imperial courts as administrators or courtiers, A number of translators were monks living in monasteries. Some were deacons serving churches. One was a canon at a cathedral. Another was a jurist. So rather than one individual or institution, we find that a host of different individuals promoted the translation activity. Sometimes the translators worked as part of vertical relationships of patronage within an institution. But in addition to patronage, translators also formed bonds across institutions that were not necessarily hierarchical. So if the translators often produced work for scholars beyond their own institution, why did they do so and what was this relationship? The writings of the translators make this clear. Time and again, the translators write that they have produced a translation as part of a relationship of amicitia. Though often translated in English as friendship, amicitia was in fact a unique social bond that could form across institutions, and unlike patronage, between individuals of equal or unequal social status. That is, bonds of amicitia could be hierarchical, but were often horizontal between equals. And as scholars of medieval amicitia have stressed, amicitia was both affective and pragmatic. It was ideally supposed to involve love, admiration, or respect, but it was also a pragmatic bond of reciprocal exchange. So if an amicus did something for you, it was expected that you would at some point do something for them. And this exchange could take the form of gifts, but it could also take the form of scholarly favors, such as producing a translation or helping someone solve a difficult scholarly problem. And one of the arguments I make in the book is that amicitia played an essential role in explaining how translators transcended their immediate local contexts and formed relationships over great distances and across institutions. Amicitia appears again and again in the writings of the translators, but we can look quickly at how amicitia figured in the work of just one translator, the Pisan scholar Hugo Therianus. Hugo worked from the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, but he produced most of his translations for other Latin scholars active in various parts of the Mediterranean and in Northern Europe, whom he referred to as his amici. One of these amici, with whom Hugo corresponded, was the powerful patriarch of Antioch, Amory of Limoges. So Hugo sent, unsolicited, a copy of one of his translations to Amory of Limoges. Hugo's first contact with Amory out of the blue was well received. Amory responds to Hugo by establishing that their relationship is one of amicitia. He calls Hugo most beloved, our amicus to be precise. And Amory then asks Hugo to send him more translations, promising gifts in return. Hugo then responds by sending Amory a copy of another translation of his, along with a letter declaring that he has done so as part of his service of a faithful amicus. So he's confirming their bond of amicitia. And finally, Amory then responds to Hugo by sending him a token of his affection in the form of a silver cup. And he requests even more translations. So the result of Hugo's unsolicited translation that he gave to Amory of Limoges was a new relationship where each party benefited. Amory received the Greek translations he coveted, and Hugo received monetary gifts, further requests for his work, and a powerful amicus in the form of Amory of Limoges, the patriarch of Antioch. Hugo's relationship with Amory, however, represents just one instance of Hugo's efforts in network building that I discuss in the book. Throughout his activity as a translator, Hugo formed bonds with scholars in the Holy Roman Empire, in Pisa, in Rome, and even in his adopted home of Constantinople. And Hugo Therianus was just one of many translators who strove to form reciprocal bonds of amicitia with scholars across institutions and over great distances. But it's important to emphasize here, though, that the translators did not only work at the request of other scholars. They also actively used their own Greek or Arabic knowledge to intervene in scholarly debates and contribute to ongoing discussions in the Latin world. The translators, that is, were scholars in their own right, with their own goals and ambitions to shape scholarship in the Latin world. So reconstructing the intellectual projects of various translators occupies a major portion of the book. Various chapters highlight how translators contributed to debates over astrology, Latin theology, the study of the natural world. But here I thought I would just briefly outline one quick example to illustrate how one translator, Dominicus Guntislinus, used new Arabic knowledge to contribute to one such debate among Latin scholars. So Guntislinus was a prolific translator who was likely born in Castile and spent most of his days translating Arabic philosophical texts in the city of Toledo. Before coming to Toledo, however, Gundelsinus likely spent time in the schools of northern France, where he was exposed to the latest of cutting-edge trends among Latin scholars. Back in Toledo, Gundelsinus not only translated texts, but also wrote original philosophical treatises using his newly acquired Arabic knowledge. One of these original treatises he titled the De Divisione Philosophiae, or On the Division of Philosophy. Ostensibly, this is a theoretical treatise on the taxonomy of philosophical disciplines, that is, what disciplines count as philosophy and how these disciplines are related to one another. In the book, I aim to show how Gundelsinus frames this work as a contribution to several ongoing Latin debates, but here I'll just highlight one question that Gundelsinus contributes to: the debate over the ideal curriculum. So the 12th century was a time when the curriculum was in flux, and the question of what the curriculum ought to be captured the interest of a great number of scholars. And just about every scholar had an opinion about this question. So most famously, you can find figures such as Peter Abelard, William Conche, and Hugh of St. Victor arguing for various visions of what the future of education ought to be. But I argue in the book that you can find translators doing the same thing. So in the case of Gundelsinus, he uses his De Divisione Philosophiae to propose a detailed new curriculum founded in large part on the original writings of Aristotle. This was Gundelsinus' key contribution to the debate over the curriculum. He was the first Latin scholar to propose a thoroughly Aristotelian curriculum founded in large part on Aristotle's own writings. Gundelsinus' revolutionary contribution to this debate not only represents an important moment in the intellectual history of the Latin world, it also serves as a paradigmatic example of the translator's role as agents linking intellectual communities. For an arguing for a thoroughly Aristotelian curriculum, Gundelsinus was in fact following intellectual trends among contemporary Arabic scholars in Al-Andalus. Gundelsinus' source was Al-Farabi's Ihsa al-Ulum, or the enumeration of the sciences. Gundelsinus uses the source critically and creatively incorporates Farabi's recommendations for an Aristotelian curriculum in his De Divisione. So Al-Farabi's work was a beloved textbook in Al-Andalus, and Gundelsinus may have been introduced to the work through his collaborations with the Jewish philosopher Abraham ibn Dawood, since Gundelsinus worked closely with Ibn Dawood and Farabi's treatise was popular among Jewish scholars in Al-Andalus. But regardless of whether Ibn Dawood in particular introduced Gundelsinus to the work, it was surely the work's popularity among scholars in Al-Andalus that led Gundelsinus to encounter the work in Toledo. So Gundelsinus' De Divisione Philosophiae was then a bridge between two scholarly worlds. It was directed to contemporary Latin scholars, above all in the schools of northern France, who were interested in the curriculum and the division of philosophy. But it was carefully crafted to be an intervention in these Latin conversations. But the context of Gundelsinus' intervention was heavily influenced by the contemporary Arabic philosophical milieu in Spain. So by way of conclusion, we can return to the map of correspondence again. And so what I hope to have been able to offer today in this brief talk is just a preview of how I try not only to reconstruct the activity of the translators on a macroscopic level, but also to zoom in on networks of translators to better understand their scholarly activity. And in doing so, I hope we can gain a new picture of the phenomenon of the 12th century translations. By looking at the social bonds of the translators, we can see that what we're seeing here plotted is not simply the translators' correspondence, but a story of translators helping other scholars with scholarly problems, answering petitions, sending their work to them, and in the process, building scholarly networks. And by reconstructing the intellectual projects of the translators, we can see that these lines also tell a story of the translators as agents linking the knowledge available to scholarly communities in Mediterranean contact zones to scholars beyond the Mediterranean. And this, in a nutshell, is the goal of the book: to reconstruct the story of how the translators actively work to spread knowledge from the Arabic and Greek-speaking world to Latin scholars, and in the process served as gears of Mediterranean interconnectivity. Thank you so much, and I really look forward to hearing your thoughts.
Thank you, John, for that introduction on a fascinating research topic. Our next speaker of the program really, of course, is known to everyone in this room, so I don't need to say a word about him, but since this is being recorded for posterity as well, I should, of course, give full titles and recognition to our next speaker. So Tom Burman, of course, is the director of the Medieval Institute, the Robert M. Conway Director of the Medieval Institute, and Professor of History here at Notre Dame. So I'm very happy to have him speak with us today. The program tells us that the talk he's giving is based off of a new book entitled Raymond Marty, Latin Scholasticism, and the Peoples of Many Books. However, via email, he tells me the book will be titled Beyond the Mediterranean, the Intellectual Venture of Raymond Marty, circa 1250 to 1284. So perhaps Tom should apply for a Mellon Fellowship as well, too, to workshop his own book. So please, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Janine, for that kind introduction. Yes, I do need a Mellon Fellowship. We all do. And thank you to John for inviting me to be part of this colloquium. It's a great honor for me. And I'm looking forward to a day of fascinating papers and discussion. Are we ready to shift to the next PowerPoint?
Yep, you just do start yours on the...
I should do this.
Yeah, just you can open your slide on the desktop.
Oh, okay.
Give us a shot if you need some help. We're back here.
All right, very good. As John Mulhall points out in the first chapter of his Republic of Translators, Stephen of Antioch explained why he translated the medical encyclopedia of Al-Majusi thus: seeking whether Latinitas had any of it, I discerned that she lacked its final and larger part. So we need a translation, and he did it. In many ways, this brief quotation gets at the heart of what Mulhall is doing in his fine book, exploring, that is, how far-flung translators in the Mediterranean interacted with and served a dynamic Latin culture, Latinitas, whose center of gravity was in northern France and England, northern Italy. On his persuasive telling, these translators were industrious agents of that Latinitas, drawn to Constantinople, to Monte Cassino, the banks of the Ebro, because of Latin Europe's need for better scientific texts, choosing books on the Greek and Arab frontiers that filled specific holes in Latin libraries or responded to specific needs of other scientists and translators, to whom they were bound, as we just learned, by amicitia. Thus, a republic of translators, an institutionally decentralized but intellectually and socially coherent network of scientist translators caught up in, inspired by, and contributing to the heady flowering of natural philosophy far away in the Latin Christian North. I would like to argue in this paper that we should understand another, slightly later Mediterranean scholar as similarly inspired by and contributing to the intellectual culture of far-off Latinitas. I'm referring to the fearsome religious polemicist Raymond Marty, who flourished in the second half of the 13th century. An Iberian Dominican, Marty is the author of 4 works: a short treatise against Islam, a pastoral treatise explaining the Apostles' Creed, and 2 lengthy works against Judaism. He is both over and understudied. We have scores of articles on this or that aspect of his knowledge of this or that Arabic or Hebrew or Aramaic text, or on the relationship between, say, his theological arguments and those of Aquinas. And all these contributions are fine as far as they go, but they don't tell us much about what I have long considered his puzzling CV, his puzzling curriculum vitae. For here is the Dominican who is usually portrayed as the very exemplar of the preaching order's commitment to evangelizing among both Muslims and Jews. A Dominican, moreover, who not only knew Hebrew and Aramaic, but also Arabic, all remarkably well, and had read an enormous range of books in all these languages. A Dominican, finally, who lived most of his life in the Crown of Aragon, in which there were scores of thousands of Muslim subjects in the south. And yet this Dominican had relatively little to say about Islam in comparison with his vast output on Judaism. Why we, or at least I, can't help asking so little on Islam and so much on Judaism? What I will suggest in the rest of this paper is that if we consider Marti to be, like the Latin translators, an agent of Latinitas, working away on the frontier, what seems so puzzling about his curriculum vitae begins to make sense. For 13th century Latinitas and its scholastic culture, it turns out had ample room for reading Jewish books alongside the Hebrew Bible, but very little for systematically engaging Islam. Marti, in other words, wrote very little on Islam and a great deal on Judaism because that's what Latinitas wanted. Now, a small warning. To make this case, I'm going to be ranging rather far afield with a discussion first of why Marti's main work against Islam on the sect of Muhammad is inadequate to the task. After which I'll argue that his outsized works against Judaism should be seen as an extension of the developing Latin Hebraist movement of northern France and England. In conclusion, I'll reflect briefly on what both the scientific translators and the Dominican disputationalist Marti have to tell us about writing the intellectual history of the medieval Mediterranean. I'm not the first historian to notice this imbalance in Marti's scholarly production, for it is glaringly obvious. At the beginning of his career in the late 1250s, Marti wrote a tract against Islam on the sect of Muhammad, in which he argued that Muhammad lacked the four signs of true prophethood. At about the same time, he composed a work called The Explanation of the Apostles' Creed that is often said to be a companion piece, an apologia for Christianity directed at Muslims, complementing the first work's polemical attack on Islam. I won't go into detail here, but I doubt very much that this second work was meant to persuade Muslims of much of anything, not least because the rest of the title of it, which is very rarely quoted as a full, and in full, Ad Institutionem Fidelium, for the building up of the faithful, suggests that it is meant as a catechetical work for Christians. At any rate, while it does allude here and there to Islam, it says nothing that was not already said in much more detail on the sect of Muhammad. The sum total of his work on Islam, then, is one slim treatise, some 30 pages long in a modern edition, and perhaps parts of another. In comparison, his works against Judaism are vast. The Halter of the Jews from the 1260s is at least 10 times longer than on the sect of Muhammad. And his magnum opus, The Dagger of Faith from the 1270s, is a full 384 folios long in the autograph manuscript that, in Paris. I'll show you an image from that in a moment. So the imbalance in Marti's production is obvious from just counting pages. But the imbalance is even more striking when we look more deeply at On the Sect of Muhammad in its broader contexts. It's true that on the surface, the tract is impressive in its frequent direct quotations of the Quran, Hadith, and Sirah literature. This manuscript in Paris is the first manuscript I ever saw this text in, and in the blow-up portion here I give you, you can see a nice clear Gothic hand here. Item dicitur in libro qui vocatur Bukhari, in tractatu fidei, a direct citation of, likewise it says, in the book which is called Bukhari, al-Bukhari, in the tract on faith, the Bab al-Iman, a direct citation of al-Bukhari's seminal collection of hadith. So on the surface it looks very learned, but in fact Marti borrowed a very large percentage of this material directly from at least two Arab Christian sources. While Marti was an active refabricator of those sources, it's quite clear that he didn't spend an enormous amount of time engaging Islamic texts directly as he confuted Islam. He was relying on these earlier sources. If this was the best that Latin Europe's best man on Islam could manage, then we can only say that it is strikingly inadequate to the task of defending Christianity in its place and time. For within the Iberian Peninsula, Christianity was under serious intellectual attack by Muslims writing in Arabic, and had long been. Consider Ahmad ibn Umar al-Qurtubi's information about the corruptions and delusions of the religion of the Christians, a work that has unfortunately received very little attention from scholars. Written in about 1220, around the time Marti was born, it is an ample treatise, in one manuscript a full 302 pages of 25 lines each. More to the point, it is both well-researched and locally sourced. It does make, excuse me, many of the standard Muslim arguments against Christianity, but it does so through engaging with some dozen Arab Christian texts, all deriving from Al-Andalus itself. A significant portion of the work, for example, is a refutation of the Trinity, in which the author quotes extensively from and rebuts two seemingly 12th century Christian works, one called Trinitizing the Unity of the Godhead, and the other called The Book of the Existing World. Al-Qurtubi, therefore, went to considerable lengths to understand Christianity as it was represented by the texts of the Andalusi Christians among whom he lived. Indeed, he even ventured well beyond the typical literature of disputation, for he quotes from, for example, what is clearly a catechetical work written by the 10th century Andalusi Christian Hafs ibn Albar, and you see on the screen the beginning of a citation familiar to some of the people in my Arabic reading group from this spring. Qala Hafs ibn Albar fi ba'd kutubihi. Hafs ibn Albar says in one of his books, and then we have a quotation describing Christian fasting practices. Marti's thin, thoroughly derivative treatise against Islam is scarcely an adequate rejoinder to a work such as this. He put nothing like the same amount of effort into investigating Islam that Al-Qurtubi put into understanding the Christianity around him. On the other hand, the scale of Marti's polemical investigation of Judaism is so vast that it is difficult to communicate adequately. This is a photograph of my copy of the facsimile edition of this work from the 17th century, and it's about 3 inches thick. So this is the Dagger of Faith in the printed form. But I'll try to give you a sense of this by giving you a flavor of his discussion of one verse, Isaiah 48:16, which he discusses in Book 3, Distinction 1 of the Dagger of Faith, which is an argument, a long argument in favor of the Trinity. Now, Isaiah 48:16 reads as follows, "Draw near to me," that is God, "hear this. From the beginning I did not speak in secret. From the time anything existed, I was there, and now the Lord God has sent me and his Spirit," a verse that has Trinitarian resonances about it. As always, Marty first presents the verse to his readers in both Hebrew, fully vocalized Hebrew, and his own Latin translation, after which he asserts, following the glossa ordinaria, that here Isaiah clarifies the Trinity, quote, briefly, plainly, and openly. But as so often in this work, Marty immediately turns his attention to Rashi's interpretation, the great 12th century, 11th, 12th century commentator on the whole Bible, French rabbi. For Rashi had explained this verse quite differently, as you might expect. In fact, Rashi says, and I do have a slide that gives you a sense of this manuscript here. You can see all the Hebrew and Aramaic written out in fully vocalized Hebrew script, and then the translations into Latin and discussion in the margin next to them. And if we blow this up, we see part of his citation of Rashi here, Masha Delar, Yahweh, the Yad Malachi, and then his translation next to it, Honus Verbi Domini in Manu Malachiae, direct translation of the first verse of Malachi. We see this over and over and over in this text. Marty, or rather Rashi at any rate, had explained Isaiah 48:16 as follows. He says that from this passage it has to be maintained that all the prophets were present on Mount Sinai, and therefore this prophet, that is Isaiah, is speaking about himself. So the plural voice, we being sent, we talking in that verse, is really Isaiah speaking to the prophets gathered at Mount Sinai. But this is not an interpretation that the Trinity hunting Marty can live with. He tells us, therefore, that the vileness, the Nikitia of Rashi's reading, can be destroyed by a passage from a much earlier Jewish work, the Aramaic Makilta de Rabbi Ishmael, and halakhic commentary on Exodus. For in its exposition of Exodus 19:2, where the law is given, it stresses that, yes, the law was given publicly at Sinai and in an open place. And at the end of its exposition, it cites Isaiah 48:16 as evidence. Marty then argues, and don't panic if you can't follow this, it is extremely tortuous. I'm just giving you a flavor. Marty then argues that the incarnate souls of the prophets could not have been present at the giving of the law either, for this contradicts Scripture as well as the judgment of the rabbis. To refute this possibility, Marty quotes another much older text, the Midrash Rabbah on Genesis 5:1, which in turn quotes still another passage of Isaiah, this time Isaiah 57:16, where God is portrayed saying that the Spirit from my face envelops itself. And so we move forward. Marty, after quoting still more Jewish authorities, rounds off his exposition of Isaiah 48:16 by scolding Rashi for being a, quote, modern, most cunning fox who is embarrassed by the interpretation of Rabbi Ishmael from the late antique period, and expounds his own novel interpretation of this verse, that it's Isaiah speaking to the prophets. Quote, "It is hence clear, therefore," Marty says, "that the middle clauses of Isaiah 48:16 are the voice of the Son sent by the Father and the Holy Spirit for the purpose of spiritually redeeming humankind." So let's review. In just this relatively short analysis of one biblical verse, Marty has quoted first the Hebrew Bible itself, and thereafter the Glossa Ordinaria, Rashi's Hebrew commentary, the Aramaic Mekilta de Rabbi Yishmael, Midrash Tanhuma, Midrash Rabbah, as well as David Kimhi's 13th century Hebrew dictionary. And this goes on for hundreds of folios of this work. So let me ask the question again. Why so little on Islam and so very, very much on Judaism? Latinitas, the learned Latin culture of Europe, is, I contend, the answer, or at least a big part of the answer. For even though the Quran had been translated twice into Latin by Marti's day, and was circulating modestly widely in the Latin world by this time, there was actually very little space within its dominant scholastic project for interrogating it or Islam more generally. One way to see this is to take out, and I highly recommend this, the fourth volume of Christian-Muslim Relations, a Bibliographical History, published in 2012. We owe it, and this is my copy with my post-it notes all over it. We owe a great deal of thanks to David Thomas and his many co-editors for the irreplaceable research tool that this is, which describes every relevant writer dealing with Christian-Muslim relations and every text in every language in chronological order. So this is about 700 pages thick. And this volume just covers the long 13th century. If we page through this research tool from beginning to end, we can't help notice how few of the great Latin scholastic intellectuals are present. We have a bit on William of Auvergne. We have a bit on Aquinas, and almost nothing else. University types in the 13th century, in fact, have almost nothing to say collectively about Islam, despite, and maybe because of, their enormous reliance on Arab philosophy and science. But if there was little space in 13th century Latinitas for thinking about Islam, there was considerable room for engaging the Hebrew Bible and post-biblical Jewish books. Since the 12th century, English and French biblical interpreters had turned with increasing interest and expertise to Jewish books, to the Targums, to Hebrew biblical commentaries, eventually to Rashi, to help them understand the Hebrew Bible. While Marti wrote no biblical commentaries, his anti-Jewish works interrogate the Hebrew Bible using techniques and exegetical logics often identical to those of such biblical commentators. Indeed, these Christian Hebraists, as they're called, including the greatest of them, Nicholas of Lyra, recognize Marti as one of their own, turning to his erudite polemical works as sources of biblical exegesis. Indeed, when Nicholas came in his own commentary to Isaiah 48:16, he simply turned to his own copy of Marti's Dagger of Faith and incorporated Marti's analysis and commentary into his own commentary. In reading the Hebrew Bible through the rich tradition of post-biblical Jewish literature, Ramon Marti was, therefore, participating in and contributing to an important current in scholastic thought. Both John Mulhall's 12th century translators and Ramon Marti's 13th century disputational texts, therefore, have something to teach us, finally, about doing medieval Mediterranean intellectual history. They urge us to conceive of an intellectual and cultural Mediterranean rather like the environmental Mediterranean that Horton and Purcell described in their Corrupting Sea that John mentioned earlier. A paradoxical sea, therefore, of profoundly connected but quite distinct intellectual microclimates. Texts, images, and ideas circulated rapidly around that sea, to be sure, but local scholarly cultures, imaginaries, and intellectual traditions molded their reception and redeployment. Thank you.
Hardus and Hermes and the Indians an alternative tradition. Now, philosophy in the Middle Ages, whether written in Arabic, Greek or Latin, is largely regarded as peripatetic, as we have already heard. The development of the works of Aristotle, from logic through natural science to metaphysics, finessed with Plato and supplemented with the works of mathematics. University education in philosophy is marked by a series of glosses and commentaries on Aristotle's works. In chronological order, we have Al-Farabi, then Ibn Bajjah, then Averroes, Albertus Magnus, Thomas Aquinas, and so on, culminating in the 11 volumes of all of Aristotle and all the commentaries of Averroes on Aristotle published in 1550 to 1552 in Venice. The origins and development of this tradition can be traced in detail and owe a lot indeed to the translations made in Toledo in the middle of the 12th century and onwards. And they involve no divine revelation or demonic participation. But there was an alternative curriculum in which Hermes takes the oral authoritative position of Aristotle, and which can be traced from the mists of antiquity. The origin of this curriculum are described in one of the Arabic texts in this tradition, a text called Al-Ma'adit, the Deities or Datis, which could be a transliteration of the Greek Mathetes, the learner. I quote, "A creator figure, Hardus, instructed Admanus, that is Adam, in logic, the hidden sciences, the subtle operations, the cultivation of all manner of plants, the knowledge of all the benefits and harms that are in moving animals, the secrets concealed in the spiritual forces established in the limbs of the animals. Hardus showed Adam, Admanus, the uses of plants and trees, teaching him rewards reaped from their powers, and he informed him of the secrets of mining or extracting metals and combining them with one another. This knowledge was summarized as the knowledge of all the obvious and hidden operations." This is a continuation of the quotation. One may note here that this knowledge was preeminently practical, and we learn that it involved the making of naira and jar, that is, mixtures of significant things, and burning these mixtures. And the first niranj prepared Admanus for learning everything that Hardus taught him. The spelling Admanus and his companion Haiwanus, written to Eve, as well as the word Niranj, suggests a Middle Persian source for this story, and parallels to this tradition can be recognized in Zoroastrian ideas of the first man, Gaigomat. It is highly likely that this knowledge was thought to have passed through Persian until it reached Arabic. It's at the very beginning of Arabic literature, probably already around in the 8th century. This knowledge was passed on from generation to generation until it was received by Hermes, often called Hermes Pers, the Persian in this context, whose books were in turn taken up by Aristotle and formed the basis of his instruction of his royal pupil, Alexander the Great. This is all a legend story. Hence it is called by modern scholars the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetic tradition. These books survive in a large number in Arabic, where their origin is repeatedly mentioned, for example in a book called the Kitab al-Istijlab, a work on catching animals without spears or nets, but by appealing to the animal's spiritual forces alone. We hear that the contents are what Hermes explained of the hidden secrets of subtle wisdom that Hardus had imparted to Admanus. And this tradition, this knowledge, was thereafter bequeathed to the Latins. The contents of this logic, of this curriculum, you might say, can be divided into two parts, one theoretical, the other practical. The theory gives both a chronology of the history of the world, from its creation to the present day, involving vast lengths of time, during which spiritual forces coalesce to form the planets in succession, and finally with a great outburst of power resulting from all the planets except Saturn being in their exaltations, Hardus himself appears and by a concentration of his thought produces Admanus. Then there are the descriptive sections concerning the relationship between the megacosm and the microcosm. The megacosm has as its outermost component the firmament, under which is the corporeal sphere of the 12 signs of the zodiac. The 7 planets, which are spiritual entities, act as doors through which the spiritual power of the firmament passes to the signs of the zodiac and to the earth. Man's head corresponds to the firmament, his chest to the sphere of the 12 signs, and his feet to the earth. Through the 7 doors of his head, 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, and the mouth, which are assigned to each of the 7 planets, the spiritual influx passes into his chest, where it rules the 7 interior organs, the heart, the stomach, the lungs, the liver, the spleen, and the 2 kidneys. In each of these organs resides one psychological faculty, such as intelligence, anger, love, etc. Spiritual forces dominate throughout these accounts. Then, much of the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica is taken up with practical instructions. These can be divided into 3 major sections: lunar mansions, Nair and Jot, and talismans. The sections on lunar mansions give instructions of what to do or to avoid doing when the moon is in each of its mansions, its constellations as it goes through in the course of a month, including the making of Nair and Jot, but also gives the character of the child born at that time, equally male and female. The sections on Nair and Jot give examples of how to make the Nair and Jot for particular purposes, love, hate, and so on. Spirit, in the form of the fumes that rise from the mixture of these significant ingredients, is conveyed through the air to the spiritual forces inside other living beings. The power of this spirit can be increased by chanting, which embodies the spirit of the voice, which is independent of the meaning of the words. And finally, there's the making of talismans, which involve bringing the celestial spirit, the spirits of the planets, if you like, into terrestrial objects. A version of talismanry without spirits relies entirely on the effects of planetary configuration, but nevertheless these celestial effects are described as the soul of the talisman, which serves as a mere useless body until the practitioner introduces the soul. The Latin tradition of this learning is gradually being discovered, one might say. We have literal translations of the Kitab al-Istijlab, of how to catch animals by appealing to their spiritual forces alone, called the Liber de Quattro Confectionibus. We have a book of the moon, which is concerning the moon in its 28 lunar mansions. And we have a book called the Liber Antimaquis, or in full the Book of Spiritual Activities of the Works of Aristotle, which is the Book of the Secrets of Hermes, which is a translation of a large part of what in Arabic is called the Kitab al-Istamatis. All these are anonymous. We don't have the name of a translator. There is, however, a whole group of Hermetic works clearly marked as the translations of Hugo's Sanctaliensis, of which John has written at some length in his book. On the instruction of Michael, apparently Athanarens, a bishop of Tarazona, a local bishop indeed, he retained his bishopric until 1151, but probably considerably earlier than that. A certain Hugo, Sanctaliensis, probably a Norman, visited the library of the last of the Islamic kings of Saragossa, who were in exile in the castle of Hueda Jalon, on a tributary to the Ebro River. And he was introduced into the more secret depths of the library, the Inter Secretiora Bibliothecae Penetralia, where he found, or was given, manuscripts of works attributed to Hermes and Apollonius, which he proceeded to translate. It is significant that, on the first page of one of these translations of a manuscript which could well have been written within Hugo's lifetime and under his supervision, we have a vivid portrayal of the transmission of science. And this is Paris BNF 13251, 951 rather. And here we have the frontispiece, as it were, to this text attributed to Apollonius on the secrets of nature. You have a whole division of science, which in fact also appears exactly in this form in a Leiden manuscript, but without any context. But here we have it as a frontispiece for Apollonius, and then you have two biographies, one of Hermes here, and you can read what he says here if you like, and then on the same frontispiece you have the biography of Apollonius. In fact, both biographies are taken from Latin sources. And this one is from Jerome, who gives a potted history of Apollonius, telling us where he went, including to the Brahmins of India, and this is where he was taught the material that he presents. But here we have that he was ambulans inter terras, and maybe there's a slight hint of being peripatetic there, but anyway, this is a very important frontispiece. I would say, contend that this is introducing not only Apollonius, but introducing this whole Hermetic corpus. This corpus consists primarily, one might say, or other than this Apollonius, of works on astrology and astronomy, but together with other forms of divination or arts that reveal the hidden, geomancy, and the divination by sheep shoulder blades. The cosmology and anthropology is what I'd like to emphasize, really. In most cases we can recognize the Arabic origins of these works, but what is special about Hugo's versions is that he gives descriptions of the texts and reasons for translating them, in other words, paratexts. He is establishing a way of thought that he finds in his Arabic sources attributed to Hermes, and which he seeks to pass on to the Latins. The largest number of the texts, as I say, are astrological. He embarks on translating a comprehensive library of texts, and indeed hints that there are many more texts. He's made a choice out of these texts, from astronomical tables through the Tetrabiblos of Ptolemy, the classical text on astrology, and astrological aphorisms, and a book of nativities and revolutions of nativities. I won't go into the definitions of these genres, which is said to be Aristotle's summary of 255 volumes of the Indians. The Indians occur here again. All these astrological works include reverent mentions of Hermes, who is identified in the last work as Buzur-Junichir, the Persian sage who was the counselor of the Persian king Khusrau, the first Anushirvan in the 6th century AD. The largest book of astrology, however, is Hugo's collection based on 9 Arabic astrologers, and therefore called the Liber Novem Judicum, the Book of the 9 Judges. This consists of a comprehensive account of astrological doctrine, followed by judgments of 7 judges, both Arabic and Greek via Arabic, which provide everything necessary for the practice of interrogations. Well, I just quote Hugo, or rather Umar ibn al-Farukhan's description of the importance of the theory of interrogations, one might say. The divine force and the property of efficiency of the celestial circle at the time of the question itself seems to be passed on to the intelligence and the mind of the questioner because of a certain similarity between the higher and the lower. For the movement of the circle compels the questioner to put the question, for the human condition does not cease to imitate the order of the affections, the affectus in Latin, and both the celestial stars and of their orbits, by the bond, as it were, of a certain love, dilectio in Latin. The most comprehensive and philosophical of his translations is this one by Apollonius, which, as is well known, Apollonius discovered the book, he says, in fact, at the very end of the text, in a cavern under a statue of Hermes. And in this cavern he found the body of Hermes, before which there was a book i.e. On the Secrets of Nature itself, which he proceeds to translate, and in front of whom was an emerald tablet, or in his hands was an emerald tablet. The Arabic means both. The first volume on the Secrets of Nature covers God and creation, the circles of the planets, the fixed stars, new minerals and vegetables. The second, animals, and especially man. Included in the book are questions about nature, such as the origin of thunder and lightning, whether trees are male or female, why thorns are necessary, and so on. The purpose through the book is to point out the underlying unity in all nature and the bonds connecting all things, which, as we have seen above, could be called love. Conspicuous is what we may call a biological approach to nature. The elements are alternately male and female, and from the mating of the male animals, of these elements, the male elements, fire and air, with the female ones, earth and water, are born everything generated in the universe. Pervading the book is exactly what we find in the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, the spirit, which we see at various levels. For example, you have the spirit arising from a mixture of water, vapor, and fire, which rises, and as it rises it becomes more and more subtle, and the most subtle spirit forms the outermost sphere of the planets, i.e. that of Saturn. The slightly less subtle spirit forms Jupiter, until the thickest of this spirit forms the sphere of the moon. The planets are described as being spiritual entities within their spheres. In Latin we have a spiritale vegetamentum, and they acquire this spiritual life force, as it were. The text ends with the emerald tablet, the famous emerald tablet, which in a kind of poetic form contains the words which became, as it were, the credo of alchemists in the West, and they're couched in a rather enigmatic form, but they begin with the words higher things from lower things from higher things, the operation of wonders from the one, just as all things draw their source from one and the same thing. And it goes on to mention talisman makers and so on, and four elements. But it's a very profound, let's say, very profound text, which occupies the same position, in fact, as the hymn at the end of the Asclepius in the Latin Hermetic tradition. So we can see that this work, although not strictly speaking pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, it actually has as its sources at least the Kitab al-Istamatis, which was translated as the Antimaquis in Latin, and also hints of other texts of the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. Most of these texts can be attributed directly to Hermes, such as the Scapulomancy, the divination by chief shoulder blades, which begins incipit liber ablaudii et Hermetis. This is probably here begins the book of Alkindi and Hermes. This book, whose author is said to have been Amulbarchis among the Chaldeans, but Hermes among the Greeks, etc. Or, if not attributed directly to Hermes, they are said to have been composed. Or there's also a book by Hermes, the Book of Rains, produced by an ancient astrologer of the Indians called Jaffa, but then abbreviated by Mercury of Sicily. So Mercury, being Hermes, is involved in all these texts in one way or another. So the frontispiece of the Secrets of Nature, which I've been discussing, would naturally introduce the whole corpus of Hermetic works translated by Hugo Santaliensis, by showing how it fitted into the division of science, or belongs somehow to the sciences, and giving portraits of Hermes and his voice, as it were, his Apollonius. What we have, you could call a pseudo-Apollonian Hermetica. One might be surprised that Hugo apparently did not translate any of these pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica directly, but this may not be strange at all, because this lack was filled by his close associate, if not collaborator, Herman of Corinthia. Again, John has discussed this collaboration, this group of scholars from northeast Spain, the valley of the Ebro, Herman, Hugo, and also Robert of Cleton, and Herman's student Rudolf of Bruges. Now, Herman is the only author we know to have had access to Apollonius on the secrets of nature, and he relates this discovery of the body of Hermes under the statue of Hermes, as well as quoting an excerpt from the Emerald Tablet. Whether this is because he knew the same Arabic manuscript as Hugo or had direct access to Hugo's translation is not clear, but they obviously were together. They were both involved with the Book of the Three Judges, which was a preliminary work to the Book of the Nine Judges. Herman's interests were also in the science of the stars, and it is significant that in his major translation, that of Abu Masha's great introduction to astrology, he diverges from his usual paraphrastic way of translating, precisely when Abu Masha quotes Hermes, which he does at some length. For example, in the 5th book of the Great Introduction, chapter 7, Abu Masha works and writes, and Herman emphasizes the fact that now we shall bring in Hermes himself, and we shall not omit a single word of what he has said. Hermes has such great respect by Abu Masha, and consequently by Herman himself. Herman, however, in addition, knew part of the pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica, since he quotes two versions of a story of the spirit of Venus descending to a man living in the 4th clime, which can be identified again in the Arabic text Kitab al-Astamatis. Moreover, in some additions to passages from Herman's translation of Abu Masha in the picture book of Abu Masha's descriptions of the planets and constellations known as the Liber Astrologiae of a certain Georgius Zopherus, Zaporus Fendrulus, probably originating in the court of Frederick II in the early 13th century in Sicily, there appears the same story of Hardus teaching Admanus, under the names here of Harus and Ismanos, with the emphasis on the science of the stars, the same story that one finds in the Arabic pseudo-Aristotelian Hermetica. So in Herman of Corinthia we find brought together two closely related corpora of Hermetica, which differ more in format than in doctrine or contents. One of these gives Hermes directly as the author, the other purports to give Aristotle's retelling of Hermetic doctrine. The attribution, which in turn is the retelling of Hardus's original doctrine. The attribution to Aristotle may have arisen out of the knowledge or the suspicion that Aristotle composed esoteric works for his immediate pupils, which were hidden thereafter from public view. Nevertheless, it was a completely different Aristotle, the exoteric Aristotle, whose works began to be known in the Latin West in the mid-12th century in Toledo, simultaneously with these Hermetica being translated by a group of scholars, and so the genuine Aristotle in Toledo and the pseudo-Aristotle, as it were, being translated by a group of scholars in the valley of the Ebro, Hugo Sanctaliensis, Herman of Corinthia. One is left to wonder what would have happened to Western intellectual history if this Hermetic corpus had been adopted into the curriculum of the nascent universities rather than the Aristotelian corpus. A choice was made, and the genuine Aristotle won. So, just to leave you with a thought.
Moving on to our final speaker, Peter Adamson is, to stick with our John's categories. Professor Charles Burnett was our traveling translator. Peter Adamson is our corresponding translator, coming to us, I believe, from Munich. He'll be able to confirm if he is in Munich or not, but that is where he is a professor of ancient and medieval philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University, and also where he holds a similar title at King's College London, so he might be corresponding from London.
He is on his way. We're just getting the switch over happening, so give us just a moment.
Excellent. So I'll just continue with the introduction. He knows quite a lot about the history of philosophy, some might say there's everything. And with the theme of the conference, I will only mention a few of his publications that deal specifically with either translation or our Peter Adamson's own translation. So beginning with his first study of the theology of Aristotle on the Arabic Plotinus, and then moving on to some of his translations of the philosophical works of Al-Kindi. He is a master in these fields, and I look forward to hearing what he has to say. It's a particular pleasure to introduce him as well, to insofar as he's an alumnus of this university. And I'll mention just one final brief book, because it originates as a series of lectures given here at the Medieval Institute. Don't Think for Yourself, Authority and Belief in Medieval Philosophy, published by Notre Dame Press in 2022. And I see him now on the screen, so welcome, Peter. The podium, as it were, is yours.
Okay, thank you. I'm very pleased to sort of be there with you today. I'm really sorry I couldn't be there in person, but I had various obligations here in Munich. I am in Munich, by the way, that I couldn't get out of. But it's really a pleasure to be here to discuss the themes of John's book, and also to sort of share a stage with one of my dearest colleagues, Charles Burnett. So I wanted to talk to you about some ideas, and I should warn you in advance, this is going to be a much bigger picture than what Charles was telling you about. So you had these really nice examples, including Al-Kindi, one of my favorite philosophers. I wanted to talk at a much more abstract and general level about translation as a vehicle for the transmission of intellectual material in general, but I'm going to be talking about philosophy in particular. A lot of what I'm going to say would certainly apply to other areas of literature, especially theology, but I'm going to obviously focus on philosophy because that's what I do. And I wanted to start off with a kind of banal observation that is so obvious that people don't usually point it out, which is that the fact that any pre-modern, and I guess by pre-modern I mean something like before the printing press. So the fact that any text that was produced before the printing press survives today is not, as it were, the default. So it's not like when people produce textual material, the textual material kind of naturally survives, and so you need to find an explanation for its disappearance if it's disappeared. I think people imagine this, maybe because there's all these stories about, like the Library of Alexandria being burned down, or people destroying books in other ways. And maybe also because we live in an age where we have instead of worrying that text will get lost, we worry that text won't be able to be eliminated. So we're worried about like leaving traces of ourselves in the digital world that we don't even know about, and we can't get rid of them, right? But in the pre-modern world, preserving and transmitting text was an incredibly laborious process, right? It was done by copying things by hand. I mean, imagine how much work went into just the images that Charles was just showing you on his slides, right? So each of those images would have taken, I'm sure, an hour or two to produce at least. And that's just one page, right? Imagine copying out something like Aristotle's Metaphysics by hand, or Plato's Republic. These are incredibly difficult things to do, time-consuming, and even for people who didn't have television, it would have been a big deal to find that much time, right? So it was expensive, it was time-consuming, and so in a way, what we should expect is that texts should not survive. And in light of that, it's really remarkable how many texts do survive. I mean, if you think about it, what we have, for example, from Greek antiquity is basically some ruined buildings, some bits of pottery, and then a massive amount of literature, right? Maybe I've forgotten some things there. I don't know, beads or something. But basically, the main thing that survives from antiquity is more ancient Greek literature than anyone could ever read, no matter how good their Greek was. So this is really astounding. So there's a big story to be told about how that happened, why it happened. It has a lot to do with Byzantium, which is one of the many things that John covers in his book. But of course, we're interested here in a more specific thing, which is translation as a vehicle for transmitting text, which of course is a way of preserving texts. And in fact, as you all know, there are some works that survive from the Greek tradition, but not in Greek. So works by, for example, Galen or Alexander of Aphrodisias that are lost in Greek, but are preserved in, for example, Arabic, right? And again, the point I just made about the fact that transmitting text is not the default goes for translations as well. So there's a really nice quote from Dennis Feeney in John's book, where he says, "The practice of translation is historically neither a necessary nor a constant feature of cultural interpenetration. Translation does not automatically follow, even from extensive bilingual or multilingual interaction." So in other words, you can have cultures cheek by jowl pressed up against each other, and they will not necessarily produce a textual body of translations. And I think this is very important because there's a deep question about the whole history of philosophy, and especially about the interaction between cultures when it comes to the history of philosophy, about how ideas travel. So these two images, I don't know if you can see this, but the image on the left is the same text in 4 different languages, right? And the one on the right is a Norman Rockwell picture of gossip, right? So these pictures are supposed to represent 2 different ways that ideas might travel from one culture to another. The one we've been thinking about is that you have a text, like let's say a text by Aristotle, and it gets translated into Latin or Arabic. These are the sort of things that John talks about in his book, that Charles was also just talking about. And we naturally think, okay, that's how Greek philosophy got to the Islamic world. And that's how Islamic philosophy got to the Latin-speaking world, right? But of course, that's not the only option, right? So as Feeney says, if you have a bilingual or multilingual environment, people could just tell each other stuff, right? You don't need to have written translations, which, as I say, are very laborious. You could just have what people sometimes call oral transmission. And I think a lot of people are quite optimistic about the idea that we could imagine philosophical ideas passing from one culture to another without any concerted attempt to translate from one language into another in the form of books that could survive today, right? I mean, whether they do survive is another matter, but the question is whether you can convey philosophy without actually writing down translations when you're moving from one language to another. And basically what I want to say is that I'm quite skeptical about this. So I think that we can consider cases where there were not textual attempts to translate philosophy, and contrast that with cases where there were attempts to transmit philosophy into new languages in the form of texts, and we see a massive difference. And I want to take two cases for this contrast. The first is the question, which is something I get asked all the time. It's probably the single most common question I'm asked when I talk about intellectual transmission, is whether ancient Indian philosophy influenced ancient Greek philosophy. And whenever I'm asked this, I get the impression that the person asking it really, really wants the answer to be yes. So, actually, that's an interesting fact. Like, why do people really, really want this to have happened? And I'm not sure. I sometimes worry that people are in the back of their mind thinking, well, if Indian philosophy influenced Greek philosophy, that would mean that Indian philosophy is interesting. Because Greek philosophy is important and interesting, so anything that influenced it was important and interesting. As it happens, I think Indian philosophy is important and interesting anyway, and it doesn't matter whether it influenced the Greeks. And also, I don't think there's very strong evidence that it did. But let me get into this a little bit further. So famously, there is no Sanskrit-Greek translation movement. We know that the Greeks and the Romans were aware of some elements of Indian science, but there's I'm not aware of a single philosophical work from the Sanskrit tradition or any other Indian language being translated into Greek. That's just not something that happened in antiquity. But there would have been plentiful opportunities for oral transmission, right? So that Alexander the Great goes all across the world, right? He gets as far as Central Asia, he reaches India, and he leaves behind a kind of Hellenistic power center in Central Asia. You have courts where Greeks are mingling with people from India. So there's every opportunity for people to tell each other stuff, right? So there's lots of evidence of trade contact. There's evidence that we actually have extant works by Greek historians writing about India, again, through the contact through Alexander. So there's a lot of opportunities. I think that an interesting test case, because it's a great example of two major philosophical cultures meeting without a tradition of translation in text. And then people say, well, look, you can see that this had influences on Greek philosophy. People are more tend to go that direction. So India to Greece, not Greece to India. They say, well, there's Pythagorean vegetarianism. Maybe that has something to do with vegetarianism in India. There's Vedanta monism. Maybe that has something to do with Plotinus or already Parmenides. India has atomism. The Vaisheshika school was atomist. And of course, the Greeks have atomism. Democritus, Leucippus, the Epicureans. Or really nice example, if you look in Indian medicine, then you see that they have humoral theory. So they have this idea that diseases are caused by imbalances of sort of fluid-like elements in the body, which sounds very much like the humoral theory that we find in Galen and other ancient Greek doctors, especially Galen. And so this would be evidence that this kind of oral transmission did have a role in constituting Greek science and philosophy. There's a book by someone named Christopher Beckwith arguing for very extensive influence of Buddhism on early skepticism, which would be one of the... And so his idea is that someone like Pyrrho the skeptic literally went east, talked to some Indian philosophers, and was influenced by them. But I'm skeptical about this. So for starters, we shouldn't underestimate, this might sound, again, this sounds like a dumb thing to say, but I'm going to say it anyway. India is really far from Greece. So I asked Google how far it is, and the answer is 3,000 miles. And that's a long way. And it's a long way even if you've got like cars, and they didn't have cars. At the risk of saying, sorry that this is also obvious, right? So if you have like someone talking to someone else in India, fine. But now you've got to get that person alive back to Greece and have them tell everyone what they heard, and that has to have an impact, right? Maybe Pyrrho would be an example, but yeah. So I think we shouldn't underestimate how challenging that is. But I think there's more less obvious reasons to be doubtful. One is that the Indian intellectual culture was incredibly elitist. So there are all these stories about people being made to wait for years, or so like sitting outside the temple or the school before they're allowed to come in and start doing even basic studies. Also, Indians, like the Greeks, were very disdainful towards people from other cultures. So they have words that effectively mean barbarian, just like the Greeks do. And I just find it hard to imagine that some Greek dude is going to kind of rock up in ancient India and be lavished with information about Indian philosophy, which was an incredibly elite and not esoteric, but the preserve of a very small group of people in India. I find that extremely implausible. And there's no translation movement, right? So there's no way we can say, well, sure, they wouldn't have told very many people about it, but at least we could get a book, and then the book would go back to Greece. That doesn't happen, right? As I've already said. And the worst thing is that if you start looking at the parallels in sort of the cold light of day, they don't really work. I'm not convinced by this idea that skepticism was influenced by Buddhism. Among other things, Buddhism is not skeptical. Buddhism is what the ancient skeptics would call dogmatic. And in other words, it takes positive views. For example, it denies the existence of the self, which is not a skeptical position. It's a negative dogmatic position, right? Skeptics don't make philosophical claims at all. Or if you take the example of the humors don't actually work the same. So that it's different humors to some extent. There's some overlap, but they're not supposed to be constituents of the body the way they are in Greek medicine. They are merely vectors of disease, with a very different way of thinking about the humors. So I think that while I wouldn't rule out that there could be some kind of connection between these two philosophical cultures, if it was through oral transmission, I think you get what you would expect through oral transmission, which is like very vague kind of echoes and not really detailed engagement. And you can contrast that to what happens with Greek philosophy closer to home, getting disseminated across what we would call the Near East, and not just the Near East, also Eastern Africa and the Latin-speaking world. So we already heard about this. So Charles was talking about Arabic into Latin. We all know about that. But so there's this kind of famous story that Greek philosophy is translated into Arabic, and then from Arabic it goes back to Latin, right? So you have works of Aristotelian philosophy brought through the manuscript tradition, being translated by Syrian Christians into Arabic, being studied in places like Baghdad or by Avicenna in Central Asia, and then, or Ibn Rushd of Averroes in Muslim Spain, and then that influences the Latin tradition, which is all true and very important. But what people, I think, don't appreciate so often is the sheer number of languages into which Greek philosophy was translated. So it's not only Arabic and Latin, it's also Syriac. In fact, it's Syriac before it's Arabic. It's also Armenian, it's also Georgian, and even the Ethiopic language called Ge'ez, which is the language of the liturgical language of the Ethiopian church. And of course, in addition to all that, you've got the Byzantine tradition of preserving the Greek works in their original Greek, right? So what that means is that Greek philosophy and also theology and so on is preserved in the form of translations in pretty much every language culture, or at least every language that was used as a literary language, like a theological language. It was translated into all of the languages that were adjacent to it, starting in the 6th century and stretching throughout the entire Middle Ages. And I think you all know about this, that the result of this is that if you're in Baghdad in the 10th century, someone like Al-Farabi or the Christian philosopher Yahya ibn Adi would have been able to read all the Aristotle that we can read. They would have been able to read paraphrase versions of Plato. They would have been able to read a translation of Plotinus that I actually wrote a dissertation on at Notre Dame, probably in the same building you're in right now, at least in part, sadly more than 20 years ago. To say nothing of works on mathematics and science, Galen, Euclid, Ptolemy, and so on. And the translations vary quite a bit. So the reason I was interested in the Arabic Plotinus is that the Arabic Plotinus takes great liberties with the original Plotinus, weaves in all these new ideas, transforms the text. Sometimes we say that it should be called a paraphrase rather than a translation, but it's sort of a combination of paraphrase, translation, and original material. So it's not what we would normally think of as a translation. But there's no doubt that Plotinus is extremely present in Arabic philosophy and extremely influential in Arabic philosophy. And there is nothing like this in the India-Greek case, right? So in the Indian-Greek case, what you would have at most is kind of distant echoes, whereas what we've got here is hundreds of pages of very hardcore Neoplatonic philosophy that was able to influence philosophy in the Islamic world for many centuries, actually right down to the early modern period, because it was still being read in Safavid Iran. And as I say, it's much more than just that. So the famous thing, and this is something that comes out in John's book, the most famous thing is this translation, like Greek, Arabic, and then Latin, right? But there's a much broader phenomenon of which the Greek-Arabic transmission is actually a part. So if you think about the fact that the translators were mostly Christians and mostly from Syria, you realize that there's a very strong sense in which the Greek-Arabic translation movement was a phenomenon that was part of what we might call Near Eastern Christianity or Eastern Christianity, often done by Nestorian Christians, for example. So Christians who have a different set of theological commitments than was embraced in Constantinople by the Byzantines, but it's Christian. And if you just, as you go through the list that I just gave you, like all the languages that these works existed in, you see that it's just all the liturgical languages of the Eastern Christian churches, right? Coptic, Ge'ez, Arabic, Armenian, Georgian. Latin, I think, is sort of a separate story. So you obviously have like people like already Cicero, actually, but someone like Boethius translating philosophy into Latin. He only gets as far as Aristotle's logical works before he's put to death. But that it has a kind of separate trajectory, I think, whereas the Eastern Christian tradition is really striking for disseminating a certain range of Greek philosophical ideas and absorbing it into theology right across the Eastern Mediterranean, the Near East, and as I said, even down into Ethiopia. So to name just a few of the major players here, we have the fantastically named David the Invincible, who is a philosopher who translates into Armenian and writes commentaries on Aristotle in Armenian. We have a Georgian writing, a philosopher writing in Georgian named Ioannis Petitsi, who wrote about Proclus. We have the Christian translators who render Galen, Aristotle into Syriac and Arabic. We have what Charles already mentioned, which is Al-Kindi and his circle, that also translate Aristotle and the Neoplatonic works. And then you have more Christian philosophers in the 10th century, so that's the century after the Kindi circle and the Hunayn circle, who are working on Aristotle in Baghdad. So this is a huge phenomenon. And I think one reason people don't take so much awareness, so much notice of it, is that a lot of these languages don't influence the Latin tradition. So they never seemed very important from a European point of view, but they have their own kind of, status and a really interesting, and they have their own priorities and agendas. And a really striking case is something I've mentioned a couple of times, which is this Ethiopian translation movement. So the translations from Greek into Ge'ez, sometimes they're translations of Arabic versions of Greek works. So we have Greek into Arabic into Ge'ez, or even Greek into Syriac into Arabic into Ge'ez, like these kids' birthday party games where one person whispers into another person's ear, right? And you go down the chain, but it's not oral, right? It's written. And something that we see in this tradition and some of the other Near Eastern Christian traditions is that they're very interested in what we might call popular philosophical works. So collections of wise sayings, or the Physiologos, which is a collection of material which talks about Christian theological and philosophical themes using images of animals. Or my favorite example, the Tale of Secundus. So this is one of the most widely disseminated philosophical works from antiquity and exists in many, many languages, including Arabic, Latin, and Ge'ez. And it's the story of a philosopher. I don't have time to tell you the whole story. It's quite something. So, if you'll bear with me for just a moment, it's the story of a philosopher who moves away from home, is sort of embarked on the course of becoming wise, and reads a statement to the effect that all women are whores. And he thinks, that doesn't sound right. I'm sure some women are virtuous. And then he does, I think, he has the natural thought, which is to go back home and see if his own mother will sleep with him for money. Because that would be a good way of testing whether all women are horse. And so he goes back, he tries this out, and she agrees. And when he reveals who he is, she kills herself. And he's so upset that he resolves never to speak again because his words have caused this horrible event, right? So it's obvious, and then what happens is that a king asks him to, since he won't talk, this king asks him to write down all of his wisdom. So after this long story about Secundus and why he fell silent, you have a set of his wise aphorisms, right? So this is obviously like a text we might have some problems with, like it's misogynistic for one thing, but it's a sort of popular narrative, and this is a very typical way of trying to transmit philosophical ideas in these Eastern Christian traditions. It's not a technical philosophical treatise, and neither are these other texts that I mentioned from Ge'ez. But we don't have Ge'ez translations of like Aristotle, even his Logic, which exists in a lot of the other languages. But we still have philosophy. So some modest conclusions, in my opinion, and I think this is contentious and is a very broad claim, so one that needs to be tested against lots and lots of different cases. But if you take the cases I've just looked at, you can see that really significant transmission of philosophy from one culture to another does require the kind of thing that John is studying in his book. It requires this republic of translators who are making the great effort to move culture, philosophy in this case, from one language into another. And for that, you need some kind of ideology or cultural framework that makes that happen. And actually, I think that an underappreciated fact is that Eastern Christianity was such a culture, because it's so striking that this happens in so many different languages. And it wasn't just Greek into Arabic. It's a much more widespread phenomenon, especially if you're a little bit more open than people usually are about what counts as philosophy. So a work of like popular philosophy that starts in Greek and then goes into Syriac, Arabic, Ge'ez, Latin, you name it. That is what a lot of people back then would have thought philosophy was, right? Philosophy was wise sayings you could share with people over dinner to impress them. And if we restrict our attention to just technical works by Aristotle being translated into Arabic and back into Latin, of course, we're studying something very interesting, but we're really missing a lot of the story. Okay, thanks very much.